Hello and welcome to Caesar and Sartre, where two scholars talk at the intersections of their field, classics, and philosophy. Um, Today we're going to be doing something a little wacky. We're going to be talking about, or at least beginning the conversation about femboys and the alt-right and see where it goes from there. Because I have some rough ideas about this phenomenon, but we were talking about it a little bit before I hit record. So my co-host here will make sure I'm not combining categories that shouldn't be combined, or if I'm combining phenomena that like need to be distinguished. Anyway, so I think there's two potentially interesting aspects, I guess, to the connection between femboys and the alt-right, which is one, mainstream society's ability to survive and perpetuate itself by absorbing identities that were once seen as potentially subversive or wrong, or unchristian, what have you, which is potentially a survival mechanism of the system, but we can put that aside for a second. I have in mind, like, 30, 40 years ago, it was far more socially unacceptable to be gay. But in recent years, we've seen a rise in conservatism among gay men, for example, which shows that the system is far more comfortable. Once a minority group, or any group for that matter, starts becoming conservative, that's when okay, the system has begun to incorporate them in a way that it is comfortable with. I guess as this applies to femboys, I think I see it partly as a way for a certain subset of the alt-right, of reactionaries, to get out desires that they cannot express. They feel like they cannot express otherwise. So if you're a young man and like maybe your sexual interests don't entirely fit the heterosexual mold, but you feel that, or you've been told that anything but strict heterosexuality is wrong, then like watching videos with femboys in them is a way of releasing some of that energy without giving up the self-identification, without giving up the straight or heterosexual self-identification, since femboys are trying to embody the feminine ideal. And I guess as this applies on the flip side, with the femboys themselves, as I think Will was mentioning before we were recording, a young, say, flamboyant or just effeminate kid, if they feel like, I can never embody this like ideal of masculinity, I don't care about sports, I'm not tough, I'm not muscular, then what they can do is, well, if I can't do this one thing, then I will just go in a completely opposite direction and just embrace my lack of masculinity by trying to be a woman or be feminine, and in this way, if you're trying to fit this like very narrow ideal of femininity or Um, yeah, if you're trying to fit this narrow ideal of femininity, um, I could see it being very easy to fall back on just very reactionary stereotypes. You know, women are passive, um, dominated, um, and in that way, you can start. You can it can the alt right worldview can start to make sense to you, and also be a way, I guess, of finding some sense of a stable identity, um, whatever that happens to be based on. Um, I guess that's my opening spiel, and you can bounce off of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be how do I put this? I think you might be like over rationalizing this. So for one thing, the vast majority of these, of femboys are like, who specifically who are on, running far right circles. Um, these tend to be like a very specific like segment of the far right. It's not like the people who are going to, um, the American Renaissance Conference or something. These are, specifically like extremely online, often socially not very well adjusted. Um, um, a lot of them, it's very much a like product of, like 2010s 4chan culture, that kind of thing. I think to a large extent. Um, yeah, there's, so like from the perspective like of the femboys, I think it's, um there's an extent to which, yes, I think it's a performance of gender, um in a way that they think that they can do, since that I mean that's like a whole, subgenre of this kind of thing, with, male failure, um that kind of, phenomenon. um and then, so yeah, from their perspective, I think it is in many ways, it has as much to do with like the kind of social maladjustment, and loneliness, often very neurodivergent people, um, who would have been on 4chan in the like late 2010s, and sites such as that. And then from the other angle, looking at people on the far right who, desire them. I think in many respects, this is just a it's just another kind of, um, how do I put this? Sexuality being as fluid as it is. Um, I think particularly with heterosexual men, there is a, frankly, like very little interest in like females on like a biological level. I don't think that there's like, I don't really think that most of them like, if you ask them, I'm sure they would say that, of course, I like pussy. I like, that, yeah, yeah, of course. But like, I don't actually think that that is true. And I'm not even sure they would be lying. I think that in many ways they're socially conditioned to believe that is true about themselves, but I don't know that that's actually true. I think, to a large extent, they're mostly attracted to, um, uh, the performance of femininity and submissiveness, and any hole's a goal, right? Um, I don't really think that, it matters to them so much, whether, what, like I don't really think that, but of course the problem with that is the rigidly heteropatriarchal situation in which they find themselves, and femboys kind of provide an excuse for that. Like, I think a lot of them would be fine with what someone might call just like a kind of feminine twink, right? I don't think that they um, I don't really think that they care that much about, you know, the specifics of the thing. Like, I don't think like internally that they would, um, but the superstructure that surrounds them, that requires them to be attracted to um, women, it is, I think, kind of the crux of the issue there.
Yeah, so you touched on a lot of things. A couple things that come to mind, I guess. I remember freshman year of college, I was taking a intro to psychology class, and I remember in the textbook, it reading in the textbook that women's sexuality or female sexuality is just like, I don't remember the exact phrase it used, but roughly speaking, inherently more fluid. Like that's just sort of, women are just more for some, so bio psychosocial
I've heard
reasons,
a version of this argument before, yeah.
um, just have a wider spectrum, say, of sexual behavior or desire. Of course, that's, I think, a potentially quite questionable assumption to make. I mean, I think it's certainly true. We are more, as a society, comfortable with a greater range of uh, uh, women's sexual expression, not because we care about women's desires necessarily, but because it's like, oh, what straight men are like, what's the desire of like seeing two women kiss, turns them on. And so it's like, even from the perspective, I guess, of the male gaze, that can allow us to be more comfortable with a wider spectrum of female sexuality. But that does not necessarily imply that men's sexuality is inherently or biologically more rigid.
See,
Um,
I actually don't know that I agree with like there's a lot of there's over the past several years there's been a lot of discussion of like men's interest in lesbianism. And I don't really think that it's like as significant as people make it out to be in like understanding people on like a civilizational level. It, I don't, or at least I don't think it's any more significant than the reverse. Lots and lots of women, primarily women, not gay men, read boys' love literature in all sorts of different societies and contexts.
I think, yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fair. Um,
And like in boys' love type literature um, and media, like it's the men in question are very like very tailored to like a female audience too. Like the just by design, everything about it. I have, I've known many gay men, and I find it hard to believe very many of them would be consuming this because it's just not like it's not tailored to like male sexuality at all. Obviously, I'm speaking in incredibly broad terms, but it's just not. I mean, it tends to read like very much like a smut novel. There's a reason these things are associated with women. Like, it's just not. It's not how these. Yeah, I don't
I mean,
know.
maybe the
My point
lesbian.
being, like, women, um, people often like I've heard like especially like from Evo psych people who say, "Oh yeah, like men are into lesbian sex because yeah, like if you were leading like a primal horde, of course you would want your you would have a giant harem of women who would all be banging, and that's like number one, the primal horde hypothesis is basically bunk. Like I don't know any like credible source who actually believes that that's how humans used to live anymore. That's pretty well understood to not have been true. It's just not. Pache Freud. Um, but on the other hand, it's like no, like women also demonstrate a pretty great degree of interest in male homosexuality. So I don't think that can really be a reasonable explanation.
I mean, I don't think I would say it's an explanation. It's perhaps the example of lesbianism is providing more diminishing returns than people realize. But I would still say, like, to take another example, I guess, like, we're more comfortable um, at a societal level with what you might call girlish fun, right? Like, I don't know, or like women being like, "Oh yeah, I experimented in college. Maybe I kissed a girl, or like blah blah blah." But I'm still straight, and it's like that's less shameful, I guess, or
Oh,
seen as
sure.
seen as
Yeah,
less
but
shameful than like a
I
guy
yeah,
saying,
that's
"Just
totally true. But I mean, I think that has more to do with the specific instantiation of American heteropatriarchy rather than um, and the really like broader like Euro-American heteropatriarchy than anything like innate. I'm not particularly averse to arguments from the innate, but I just don't really think that like trying to explain it in terms of evo psych really makes a ton of sense.
Well, I think I'm speaking at the level of like society, not the level of biology. But yeah, I brought. I mean, I agree with you. Um, I guess returning to Femboys for a second. One thing that I find interesting, I guess, is, and this doesn't just apply to femboys. This applies to various minority groups and gender nonconforming people. Um, to what extent are identities? Um, to what extent are identities sort of subversive at some fundamental level, or is that a bit more contingent and arbitrary, and um, is it possible for these exact same identities to be completely non-subversive, even from the perspective of the superstructure? Because I think some like queer theorists um, or like um, critical theory types would say like, oh, transness is inherently subversive, for example. I mean, and to some extent, I mean, there is a subversive element to it. I mean, like, because I think one I'm pretty sure I mentioned this somewhere in my like my master's thesis. I mean, one reason I think trans women are vilified and demonized is because from a heteronormative patriarchal perspective, if you're someone who has a certain degree of privilege but gives it up willingly, um, then that seems to that would undermine, from the perspective of the powerful anyway, sort of the justification for those categories and those privileges to begin with.
Yeah, I would
Uh,
agree with that.
at the same time, though, I mean, since you do have people like Caitlyn Jenner or Blair White, um, sort of embracing, a mainstream Republican platform, it's, I mean, often by disparaging other queer people in the process, but still maintaining like, oh, my identity is valid. I'm still a woman. Um, so it makes me wonder, I guess, like how subversive these identities truly are at a more basic level. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you mean. But it depends on what you mean by a like more basic level, right? Like, I don't really think that any of this matters on like a like beyond like the superstructures of our civilization. I don't really know if it like if any of it means anything um on like if we were, you know, running around in loincloths and ululating um, and such. I don't don't particularly. I doubt it would matter. But you know, I mean, I think it is. But you know, on a societal level, I think it is almost inherently subversive. I mean, and I think this is evidenced by the fact that the you know the femboy fascist phenomenon has been, you know, generally rejected by the broader far right. Um, I don't think that you can. I mean, and you know, you can look at this a lot of different ways, but I mean, just like on a basic materialist sort of Marxist kind of perspective, uh, the reason that queerness is a threat is ultimately that um, it not it's people sometimes frame it in terms that like imply that the individual non-reproduction of one person matters, and it doesn't on like a societal level. But on a societal level, the generalized understanding that we can have all of the, you know, a giant subset of the population that doesn't reproduce, if we don't have more laborers for coming generations, is, you know, that is very subversive. Um, I mean, think about how women's liberation went about they went about, you know, like the what am I thinking? Like the restructuring of gender relations after, you know, the 1960s and 70s, right? Like, well, now, you know, women have access to abortion, women have um, the ability to divorce and such. What wound up happening was because quite frankly, second wave feminism was largely a bourgeois phenomenon. The you know what what wound up being lionized is the single mother. We there was a rather large push in American society to say, oh look, you know, like the Dolly Parton song, right? Single mom who works two jobs, loves her kids, never stops, right? Like that's an empowered woman, and you know, manifestly, it's actually an extra subjugated woman, if anything, because now she uh, is required to do all of the domestic labor of rearing future laborers, while also, you know, doing a job, or in the case of the song, two jobs. You know, but they're working themselves to the bone. That is actually deeply servile. But that is right. That's how women were able to be incorporated into this system. How women were able to achieve a measure of equality with men by ultimately still not being equal, because they're still expected to do tasks associated with domestic servitude.
yeah,
And
I mean, you notice
on the other
this.
hand, of course, you know, you get like queer people and trans people, like the entire like you know, there are queer people who adopt children or whatever, but by and large, you know, they're not reproducing, they're not and they're not contributing to the societal reproduction within nuclear households.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I mean, I think I more or less completely agree with you. I mean, the irony, though, of course, is like most, like trans people in America are actually a very small subset of the population. So, I mean, that's ideologically, it's a threat that there's these groups of people who like may not produce biological children, but I think they're um, proportionally it's seen as a greater threat than it actually
Right.
is.
That
You
and
know,
that's kind of what I was getting at there.
it's
It's
not
not so
stopping
much that
heterosexual couples from reproducing and creating good future workers.
right. I think what I was getting at there, that's why I said, like on the individual level, it really doesn't matter that much. Because I mean, there's going to be a measure of heterosexual people who also won't reproduce for any number of reasons. But it's that, like, on the ideological level, that's a threat because it suggests that you can make choices in your life that just fundamentally reject the notion that your existence is to secure a continued existence for your family. Right. This is the ideological slop that is fed to proles. That you need to keep you need to you need to have children so they can have children. You can have a legacy. Well, of course you won't have a legacy. You don't matter. Just flatly, you are a slave to the ruling class, um, and your reproduction is actually for their benefit. Um, Not to say that people shouldn't have kids or whatever. Live your life, but I just like on like in talking about like the way that liberal society is organized, people are expected to have children for ultimately for this reason. And so showing them that there's actually more that you can have a life and a legacy, and it has nothing to do whether you have genetic descendants or not, is, I think, much more threatening than something like women's liberation.
I really like the point you were making about the second wave feminism of like the 60s and 70s, because you even notice this um, with Turkish history. You look at Kemalism under Ataturk. It was an ideology, and it was Turkey. The Republic of Turkey was arguably one of the first actually like feminist states, insofar as they were actually enshrining into their laws
Right.
uh, legal equality. But then there's the distinction that again Marxists will always make about, well, there's the legal equality on paper, but then there's the societal norms and expectations that can actually coincide with that legal inequality, can actually be quite conservative and oppressive, because like these Turkish women were um, they did have a double burden on their hands. They were
Right.
expected to go to work, dress in like a more Western style, um, and they were expected to meet this like Western bourgeois liberal ideal of modern womanhood.
Hmm.
But there was not the same expectation that like men take up extra childcare or extra housework.
Right.
And so some of these women, I mean, if they were wealthy enough, sure, they would just hire maids or nurses or something for some of that work. But that many of these women still had to, clean the house, feed the kids, tuck the kids in, on top of um, being a active citizen, engaging in politics, having a job, um, and So it's a way in which there's a greater illusion, I guess, of equality or of more equality than there actually is in practice.
Right. Yeah.
Um, which is the heart of the issue with bourgeois feminism and bourgeois ideologies in
Yeah.
general.
Which I
Um,
mean, when you're talking about like queerness, right? Like it does require like on the individual level, at least it requires a very like fundamental restructuring of one's life. This is a terrible term that I hate a lot, but heterotemporality that kind of like breaks down um, in most queer people's lives because the superstructures that are attached to a heteronormative lifestyle kind of don't exist, and that is fundamentally a kind of threat um, the to the system.
yeah, I mean, I think we've had a mild disagreement about this in the past, insofar as how relevant it is in like 2026 in America, insofar as even some heterosexual people are seeing um, a shift in the time frame they might get married, have
Right.
kids, a career. Um, but I still think there's a certain and I wouldn't completely disparage the concept, I guess, because like
Yeah, yeah. I've said before that I also think that that's breaking down.
yeah, I
I
mean
think, but we're kind of living at a unique historical moment. Um, even just like 10, 15 years ago, this was very much still very much still like rigidly enforced in a way that I don't think it is anymore. Um, and I think to a large extent that is liberalism kind of failing on its own merits. All of the problems that have been created by the liberalization of society and the economy are coming to a head. Um, no one goes outside anymore because they all use dating apps, which on a logical level should be far more efficient than going outside and meeting people. But of course, that's not true. And anybody who's used them can tell you that these were, yeah,
well, I was going to add, I guess, like the level at which I think hetero temporality um, makes sense is if you look at like, I mean, like I don't know, a trans woman's life. I mean, if she comes out in her 20s or say or later, she didn't have the girlhood that like a cis woman did. She didn't internalize those norms that femme presenting people internalize. Maybe so she has to. I mean, this is why some trans people often talk about like a second puberty, right? It's like, okay, new hormones, your mind sort of not restructuring itself, but it's taking on a different flavor. um, and you have to rethink about you have to go back to the drawing board to some extent when it comes to relationships, when it comes to how you when it comes to safety outside the home. um, so I think that's the level at which I would say there can like that queer time could still be a relevant concept to apply in people's lives, even if we're at a point in like the development of liberalism where um, the more rigid social structures are just breaking down for pretty much everyone.
yeah, and I think that's true. Um, yeah, uh, I think the real thing is like I don't know that when you say you have a second puberty, or have to, the restructuring of your mind or whatever. I was talking about this the other day, but I mean, I think there is really just a real problem with like the sort of perpetual adolescence I think a lot of young people find themselves in now. And this is sort of caused by the same issues. But
Well, I think I would
regardless,
say queer time and permanent or perpetual adolescence are slightly separate. I mean, maybe they're connected in
no,
some
no,
way.
no, they are different. But I
They're
don't
separate.
really. That's what I'm saying when I think like you know heterotemporality isn't like, it doesn't really seem like it kind of exists anymore. But regardless, it doesn't really matter. That is less an ideological threat and more a material one. Um, but the reason that queerness is ultimately subversive is, yeah, the when people learn that they can make a place for themselves in the world outside of you know the fulfilling the gendered expectations placed on them, which largely are for the purpose of them creating and maintaining stable households so that they can reproduce. I think that that is ultimately the reason that this is subversive. I mean, it doesn't matter if you are, far right or whatever. It can't really be integrated into a heteronormative liberal society in the same way that um, women's liberation was achieved.
I think though, like I guess to go back to one of the first things I was saying, like um, perhaps one of the more pernicious things about bourgeois ideology is or bourgeois values is when you look at like um, oh, I don't know, when you look at Raytheon, right, supporting gay pride, for example. When you look at corporations like every June like milking that cow for all it's worth, um, there's an extent to which I guess the system can try to undermine that subversiveness
Yeah,
by making it shinier, more palatable, um, and this is sort of why, arguably, this is maybe just how like social systems or superstructures perpetuate themselves. I don't know. That's a bit more of an empirical question, but I mean, there is a way in which the powers that be, I guess, to pardon, if you'll pardon the phrase, can try to take the teeth out of the animal, and to that extent, try to minimize the subversiveness and try to maintain the norms that allow them to stay in power.
yeah,
Um,
and that's true. But I mean, it's true in the same way that um, a lot of college courses will, they'll, especially in like sociology, because sociology, basically you can't really do sociology without an understanding of Marx and critical theory. Is they basically try to turn him into a liberal figure. But I mean, that only works to a point. Like anyone who's literate enough to be studying sociology will quickly discover, if they somehow don't already know, that Marx is not, in fact, the liberal individual that they make him out to be.
Oh yeah. No,
So
I totally agree with that. Um, I don't know. I think yeah, I had a thought by that, but I lost it. I don't know. I mean, gender norms. Um, well, this is why I guess I think that like gender is such a important topic to study, I guess, and why I bothered to write a master's thesis on it. I mean, it's something that's so it's one of those things that's just like so in our face, I guess, that it's easy to absorb bad ideas about it, or it's easy to think about it relatively uncritically because most of us have a sense of being gendered, or most of us have a sense of other people being gendered. Um, but once you, I think about it more critically, then a lot of questions arise without any obvious answers, like how, well, the whole a debate people love to get into about like, well, is gender a social construct, or is it a more innate biological phenomenon, or some combination thereof, or is it what Judith Butler says? Is it just uh, putting on a performance in the same way that an actor is playing a character in a play? Um, on the face of it, there aren't necessarily obvious answers to these questions, but I guess for those of us who are um, left leaning, who believe in some vague abstract concept like human liberation, um, it's worth thinking about these questions so we can live a more fulfilling uh, life, and people can actually flourish instead of just being cogs in a machine. I mean, maybe that sounds cliche, but I'm just thinking out loud.
yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I think about, or at least I used to more. I used to think about, gender abolition and liberation, and Butler's um, thesis and everything surrounding these subjects a lot. And I suppose I just think they're a bit too optimistic. Um,
Who is?
the Butler.
But
I think they have a very like uh, ultimately a kind of liberal perspective on what gender is and what it does. I don't really know if you can get around the fact that gender is constructed so as that um, um, women are disempowered relative to men. I don't really know that you can have the category of like even in here's like even in like societies which were ostensibly matriarchal. Certain American Indian groups and things have had those. I mean, fundamentally, um, yes, the women did like governmental decision making, but they were still subject in many ways to the same pressures. I'm not sure that it's really like escapable as long as gender exists in some form that we can recognize.
um, I mean, I don't know how much detail we want to go into, and I mean, you've read a portion of my thesis. I don't know if this is a good time, or if it'd be helpful for me to express some of what I wrote about that very topic. To toot my own horn, I guess, here for a second. Um, because what you said, I think, is like the philosopher Sally Haslinger. Um, she has a sort of a similar view. I mean, she basically says someone is a woman if they are marked by society as having a female role in reproduction, and therefore having a subservient, um, being treated as subservient.
Yeah, I
And
mean, I don't know if I go as far as like Haslinger, but I mean, I think there is probably some validity to the idea that um, femininity, as we understand it, is kind of constructed as a ultimately submissive and servile position. It seems that like the prospect of gender liberationism, as Butler describes, doesn't really seem possible insofar as gender is defined.
well, I guess the thing from my perspective is um, any attempt to define, like, I don't know, what a woman is or what a man is, and this is like the turf talking point. You know, you go on TikTok, you find some turf streaming live there, and they're, you
Um,
know, just badgering people about what is a woman, what is a woman, give the necessary and sufficient conditions of womanhood. And then you think about this for 2 seconds, and you're like, well, I mean, you can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for a concept that's um, that malleable. You know, it's more like the concept of a game or the concept of a table. I mean, give
oh
the
no!
necessary sufficient
Oh no!
conditions.
Not this again.
Give the necessary and sufficient conditions for a table. You can't do it. Um,
Well, listen, okay, women are like porn. I know it when I see it.
um, but I don't know. I think my perspective, or I've come to the perspective, which is I think gender is a mix of um, personal inclinations that show up relatively early in psychological development, mixed with um, the culture's own norms surrounding gender. Um, and that you can't really have gender without one or the other. That it's more of a process that goes into making it than one factor alone. Um, and I guess for that reason, I tend to lean towards a kind of gender liberationism, um, because I think if gender is partly a result of um, what Julia Serrano calls like innate inclinations, but innate inclinations that interact with the culture, um, then it seems to me it's not so much a question of just uh, of just abolishing those norms, but it's a question of allowing those inclinations to express themselves however the individual um, however the individual decides to do that. And I think that's, you know, but to do that you have to get away from an emphasis on reproduction. You have to get away from an emphasis on men have to be a certain way, women have to be a certain way. And
Sure, and
I think
that's
the analogy I guess I used in my paper is um, if someone has religious trauma, um, one response to that is to say, well, is just to say, abandoning religion entirely and say it's stupid, it's dumb, I don't want anything to do with that. Another potential response would be to develop a new relationship with a new personal relationship with that religious tradition, or perhaps joining a different religious tradition. And so, in the same way, I think like if someone finds womanhood traumatizing, or rather, if they've been traumatized because they've been categorized as a woman, I don't think it's so much. I don't think the solution is to say, well, let's get rid of the concepts of manhood and womanhood altogether. It's to allow a more malleable, a more individualistic attitude towards these concepts that allows people to, maintain whatever inclinations or dispositions or desires they have, while at the same time not perpetuating the oppression.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that like there's a measure of the oppression just kind of built into it. Um, but these things. You know more about this subject than I do by far. Um, I don't know. Um, uh, I do. What was I going to say? I don't even
Well, I
remember
guess
now.
just to say one quick thing. I don't mean to interrupt, but if we look at I guess the only reason I'm suspicious of the idea that, say, subservience is built into femininity, I guess, is um, if you look at the animal kingdom, there's a great book, and of course I forget the name of the author. She's an evolutionary biologist, but it's called Evolution's Rainbow, and it's a very detailed overview of um, sexuality across the animal kingdom and what you might call sort of quasi gender or
Hmm.
quasi gender roles in the animal kingdom. Um, and I don't think if you look at the full spectrum of like quote unquote gendered behavior among animals or sexual behavior among animals, that it's always true that the female of the species is or acts subservient. And so to that extent, I don't think to that extent it seems to me that that femininity that wouldn't imply that femininity has built into it subservience. I mean, I guess my argument's implying that there's a certain kind of femininity and masculinity in the animal kingdom, which I think there is, if we're defining that as just like typical characteristics, behaviors of males, females of these
Hmm.
species. Um, so yeah.
That's yeah. I don't know. As I've said, you know more about this stuff than I do. Um,
No,
it's
I'm
really,
not. I'm not trying.
I
I'm
wouldn't
not
call
trying to say.
myself an abolitionist under any case, though, because I just don't really think that like whatever. I think like we either have to move towards something like gender liberationism, or we're just kind of doomed to deal with this forever. Um, that's I'm not sure which actually can manifest. I guess I'm not entirely convinced of the possibility of gender liberationism, but I don't really think abolitionism can be either, because there's, as you've said, a lot of it has to do with innate inclinations. Every society of humans that we are aware of in any capacity has created something that looks like gender. It seems to be an inevitability. Oh,
Oh, hello. Sorry about that. We were having some technical difficulties. Um, but I think we've probably reached a good stopping point in the conversation. I don't know if there's any closing thoughts you wanted to add. Um, Alrighty then. Well, we started off with talking about femboys, so then we just went off talking about gender and the superstructure and feminism and all sorts of other things. Next episode will probably be more structured. We need to get to Rosa Luxemburg. I've been procrastinating on getting to Rosa Luxemburg. But yeah, so thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.